Atlantic Ocean, 1943. The sea was a sheet of black glass, the moon slicing silver across its surface. On the bridge of a small destroyer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Simmons watched the horizon, eyes straining through salt and fog. Somewhere out there, beyond the pale line of moonlight, something moved. The convoy stretched for miles, tankers, freighters, Liberty ships, each one carrying the weight of a continent's hope. Beneath them, German submarines prowled in silence, waiting for the moment to strike. Then, at the rear, one ship fell behind. Old, slow, alone, a perfect target. Through a periscope lens, it looked defenseless, but the Germans couldn't see the hidden guns beneath its deck, nor the false cargo stacked above the steel. The hunter was being hunted, and as the waves rolled under the cold Atlantic moon, one truth became clear. This was no ordinary sea. The ocean had become a theater of illusion. In the autumn of 1939, as war ignited across Europe, the Atlantic Ocean became more than a body of water. It became the artery of survival. Britain's lifeline stretched across those cold gray waves, carrying food, fuel, munitions, and hope from the factories of North America to the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow. Without it, the island nation would starve. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, understood this. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, believed he could choke Britain into submission, not by storming its shores, but by severing its veins. His plan was mathematical, ruthless, and effective. Sink merchant ships faster than they could be built. And for the first 2 years of the war, it worked. The U-boats hunted in packs, brutal tactics, as Dönitz called them, striking convoys by night. The periscope lens was their eye, the torpedo, their fang. Between 1939 and 1941, they sent millions of tons of shipping to the ocean floor. Survivors spoke of oil-slicked waves, burning cargo, and the haunting sound of men knocking on the hulls of sinking ships. The sea had become a graveyard. The early convoys were thinly guarded, often just a handful of destroyers and corvettes, escorting dozens of freighters. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across the globe, defending colonies, supply routes, and the home islands. Merchant captains sailed knowing that luck was their only armor. Every journey across the Atlantic was a gamble, one roll of the dice between life and death. Then, in 1940, the storm grew darker. France fell, and the Germans gained control of the western coast of Europe, giving their submarines access to the deep water ports of Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. From these fortified pens, the U-boats could launch directly into the open Atlantic. The wolf packs no longer needed to stalk the shallows. Now they could hunt in the heart of the ocean. By 1941, Britain stood alone, its imports shrinking, its morale tested. Churchill called the Battle of the Atlantic the only thing that ever really frightened me. And for good reason. Without the Atlantic supply lines, every front, from North Africa to the skies over London, would collapse. Then came a shift that changed everything. Across the ocean, the United States, not yet at war, began to move quietly but decisively. The Roosevelt administration initiated the Lend-Lease program, sending vital materials, vehicles, and weapons to the Allies. American shipyards worked day and night, forging the Liberty ships that would one day number in the thousands. They were simple, functional, and fast to build, each one a lifeline made of steel and sweat. But American involvement brought more than material. It brought industrial power, and soon naval might. When German U-boats began attacking American shipping in early 1941, the illusion of neutrality vanished. The U.S. Navy established the Eastern Sea Frontier, organizing convoys along its coasts and deploying aircraft to patrol the shipping lanes. Still, the learning curve was steep. The early American convoys were as vulnerable as Britain's had been 2 years earlier. U-boats prowled the waters off New York and Cape Hatteras, sinking ships so close to shore that coastal cities could see the fires on the horizon. The Atlantic was now a single, shared battlefield, stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Yet even as the losses mounted, a quiet transformation was underway. Allied planners realized that brute strength alone could not win this war at sea. They would need something else: coordination, intelligence, and, eventually, deception. The fight for the Atlantic was not just a clash of steel and torpedoes. It was a contest of minds. And so, as 1941 drew to a close and America entered the war in full, a new phase began, one that would blend technology, strategy, and illusion into a single, unseen weapon. By early 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered its deadliest phase. Convoys were the veins of the Allied war machine, and the U-boats were slashing them open with surgical precision. That spring, over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping was lost in a single month. It seemed that Dönitz's prophecy, to cut Britain's arteries and bleed it dry, might come true after all. But the Allies were learning faster than the enemy could adapt. The key to survival lay in coordination, in turning chaos into a system. Convoy escorts were reorganized, and the old, overworked destroyers were joined by a new breed of smaller, faster ships: corvettes, frigates, and escort destroyers. Each was designed not to attack fleets, but to protect lifelines. Their job was simple: keep the U-boats down long enough for the convoy to live. Then came technology. Allied ships began to carry ASDIC, the early form of sonar, which could detect submarines by bouncing sound waves off their hulls. Radar, once crude and unreliable, became sharp enough to spot a periscope cutting through the waves. High-frequency direction finding, known as HUF-DUF, allowed shore stations to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions. The silent hunters of 1939 were now being tracked by invisible eyes. In the skies above, aircraft extended the reach of protection. The introduction of long-range patrol bombers like the B-24 Liberator closed the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap, that deadly zone where no escort or aircraft could once reach. The wolfpacks could no longer strike with impunity. The sea itself had turned against them. And yet, even with new weapons and new eyes, the Allies faced a different challenge: deception. The Atlantic was vast, and the enemy's reach was unpredictable. Technology could protect, but illusion could mislead. It was here that the Allies began to experiment with one of the strangest weapons of all: fake ships. The idea wasn't new. During the First World War, Britain had deployed Q-ships, merchant vessels fitted with concealed guns, designed to lure submarines into attacking on the surface before striking back. The concept was simple, brutal, and psychological. The hunter would become the hunted. In World War II, the principle returned, but this time the deception deepened. Some ships were fitted with dummy masts and altered silhouettes to confuse reconnaissance aircraft. Others, painted with false hull numbers and fake company markings, sailed as decoys, bait meant to draw U-boats away from real convoys. In certain cases, empty cargo ships would transmit fake radio traffic, creating the illusion of fleets where none existed. The ocean itself became a stage for deception. Dummy convoys, false distress calls, and deliberate radar blips were all part of a growing effort to make the enemy doubt his own instruments. The Allies were learning to weaponize uncertainty. Behind these illusions was a powerful new foundation: industrial production. The United States, now fully mobilized, had transformed its shipyards into engines of war. At places like Kaiser's Richmond Yard in California and the Bethlehem Fairfield Yard in Baltimore, ships were built with staggering speed. Liberty ships slid into the water faster than submarines could sink them. By 1943, a new ship was being launched every few hours. For every U-boat that prowled the Atlantic, there were now dozens of Allied hulls replacing what was lost. But numbers alone did not win the ocean. It was the combination of industry and intelligence, of mass and mind. The Allies didn't just build ships. They built systems. Shipping lanes were reorganized, radio codes refined, and intelligence shared across nations through Bletchley Park and Washington's Navy Department. Each intercepted message, each decoded signal, was another step toward turning the hunters into prey. And so, by late 1942, the Atlantic began to shift. The U-boats were still deadly, but their dominance was no longer certain. The convoys were protected not only by guns and depth charges, but by shadows and tricks, by phantom ships and false echoes. The battle for survival had become a battle of deception. And from that deception, something extraordinary would emerge. A phantom fleet that Germany would never see coming. For the men who sailed the convoys, the Atlantic was not an abstraction of strategy. It was a living, breathing enemy. Merchant seamen were civilians, often barely trained, facing torpedoes and storms with nothing but courage and luck. They slept in their boots, ate in the dark, and prayed not to hear the whistle of a torpedo. A single hit could break a ship in two, leaving men adrift in freezing black water. Many never resurfaced. On the escort ships, life was no less brutal. Destroyer crews endured sleepless nights, their ears tuned to the sonar's rhythmic ping. Every sound beneath the surface could mean life or death. They fought not for glory, but for endurance, for the silent duty of keeping the convoys alive. And then there were the Q-ship crews, volunteers aboard vessels designed to deceive. They sailed under false flags, feigning helplessness until the moment they revealed their hidden guns. Their courage lay not in attack, but in patience, waiting for the unseen enemy to strike first. They lived between truth and illusion, the most dangerous place a sailor could be. Their war was not waged with medals or headlines. It was fought in silence, in darkness, against an enemy they often never saw. Convoy warfare was a game of invisible geometry, of lines, circles, and timing. Every convoy was a moving fortress, dozens of merchant ships arranged in columns, flanked by destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers. Their course was unpredictable, shifting with coded instructions to outwit German trackers. Admiral Dunitz's wolf packs operated with precision, guided by radio intelligence and long-range reconnaissance aircraft. They struck at night, surfacing to fire torpedoes in coordinated attacks, overwhelming the escorts. In the early years, it worked. But soon, the pattern changed. Allied commanders began forming hunter-killer groups, small, aggressive teams of escort ships and aircraft carriers designed not just to defend, but to destroy. Using intercepted U-boat transmissions, they anticipated attacks before they happened. The convoy was no longer passive prey. It was bait. Every maneuver, every signal, every depth charge pattern was designed to disrupt the enemy's rhythm. The Atlantic became a chessboard of unseen moves, where silence, timing, and deception mattered more than firepower. In this new kind of warfare, victory was not about who fired first, but who was willing to wait longer in the dark. If endurance and strategy kept the convoys alive, technology turned the tide. Early in the war, escorts fought blind, firing depth charges into empty water. But by 1942, they could see, not with eyes, but with sound and signal. ASDIC sonar transformed the hunt. A single pulse could reveal a submarine's presence, its echo whispering through the ship's hull. The radar, mounted on masts and aircraft wings, could spot periscopes and U-boats surfacing to recharge batteries. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, tracked enemy radio signals, narrowing their location to a patch of ocean no larger than a city block. Then came new weapons. The Hedgehog, firing dozens of small explosives in forward arcs, and improved depth charges, dropped in patterns so precise they could crush a U-boat's hull beneath hundreds of feet of pressure. Above them, Escort carriers extended the reach of protection. Small aircraft decks on converted merchant ships, bringing air power into the heart of the Atlantic. They carried swordfish and wildcat aircraft, turning the gray expanse into a sky of steel. Technology didn't just change tactics, it changed psychology. The U-boat, once the hunter, now felt hunted. For the first time, the depths offered no safety. Deception at sea was both art and necessity. The Atlantic was too vast to guard by strength alone. So the Allies began to guard it with illusion. They turned the ocean into a chessboard of ghosts. Some ships sailed under false identities, dummy freighters, stripped of valuable cargo, disguised to appear loaded. Others carried decoy masts, fake lifeboats, or altered silhouettes to confuse German reconnaissance aircraft. Radio operators sent false transmissions, crafting phantom convoys that lured U-boats toward empty water. The aim was simple: waste the enemy's time, scatter their attention, and make them doubt what was real. And at the center of this illusion stood the Q-ships, the successors of the Great War's secret vessels. Outwardly helpless, they masked hidden guns behind collapsible panels and painted-over ports. Their role was not to survive, but to deceive, to bait the hunter until it came close enough to kill. Every successful deception bought time, and time was the Allies' greatest weapon. With every misdirected attack, another real convoy slipped safely across the sea. The Atlantic had become not just a battlefield of steel, but a stage of shadows. While deception and tactics saved lives, it was industry that sustained the war. The United States, awakened by Pearl Harbor, unleashed an industrial miracle unmatched in history. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators now produced tanks, guns, and ships, thousands of them. The Liberty ships became the lifeblood of the Atlantic, simple, boxy, and efficient. They could be built in weeks, not months. In 1943 alone, over 2,700 ships were launched, an average of one every few hours. The Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary was famously completed in less than 5 days. Each vessel represented not just cargo, but a defiance of fear, proof that the U-boats could not sink faster than America could build. At the same time, smaller escort vessels, corvettes, frigates, and destroyer escorts rolled out of shipyards at a relentless pace. The Kaiser yards on the U.S. West Coast, the Great Lakes shipyards, and the Halifax and Belfast docks turned out fleets of protection faster than the enemy could comprehend. Behind these ships stood an invisible army: welders, engineers, women riveters, and dockyard crews working by torchlight. For every man at sea, 100 labored on land. Together, they created what historians later called the Second Fleet, the one that was never meant to fight, only to exist faster than destruction. The result was a paradox of war, an empire of peacetime workers building the tools of victory. To the Germans beneath the waves, the change was both gradual and terrifying. In 1940, the U-boat men had ruled the Atlantic. They called it the happy time, an era when convoys burned nightly on the horizon, and each patrol returned laden with victory. But by late 1942, that confidence began to fade. Reports came back of convoys that never followed expected routes, of merchant ships that suddenly opened fire, of aircraft appearing from empty skies. The B-Dienst, Germany's naval intelligence branch, struggled to decode Allied convoy signals, but their successes were shrinking. The Allies had begun encrypting communications faster than they could be broken. What unsettled the U-boat crews most was the sense of being watched. Radar pings echoed across their receivers, sonar pulses traced their positions, and depth charges rained from above with unnerving accuracy. Some submarines reported being attacked in areas where no convoy was visible, chasing ghosts created by false transmissions. And Dummy radar echoes. The wolf packs that once hunted with confidence now found themselves stalked by shadows. In Donitz's war diaries, his frustration is palpable. We fight blindfolded. The enemy knows everything. We, nothing. By 1943, the tide had turned irreversibly. The hunters had become the hunted, and the once invisible fleet of Germany was being outmatched by an even more invisible force. One built not of steel, but of information, deception, and relentless production. The Kriegsmarine had entered a war it could no longer understand, and the phantom fleet that haunted its commanders was not a myth. It was real, and it was coming. The winter of 1942-1943 marked the hinge of the Atlantic War, the moment when the hunters of the deep began to falter. For 3 years, the Kriegsmarine's U-boats had prowled the North Atlantic with near impunity. Now, they were about to face a sea that no longer belonged to them. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with convoy ONS-5 in April 1943. 50 merchant ships sailing from Britain to North America, laden with steel, food, and fuel, the artery of the Allied war effort. The convoy's escort group, under Captain Robert Sherbrooke, was small but skilled, destroyers, corvettes, and the new Flower-class ships equipped with radar, sonar, and the mysterious new weapon the sailors called the Hedgehog. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, this was an opportunity to crush Allied morale. He dispatched over 40 U-boats, organized into a wolf pack he named Star. The orders were simple: annihilate the convoy. The submarines waited in ambush, spread across the North Atlantic like teeth in the dark. But the ocean had changed. What Dönitz did not know was that the Allies had begun coordinating convoys using high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, the Huff-Duff system, which could triangulate U-boat radio signals within minutes. The escort commander now knew roughly where the wolves waited. When the attack came, it was chaos. For 3 nights, April 29th to May 5th, the sea boiled with depth charges and tracer fire. Ships burned, others vanished beneath the waves. The merchant sailors fought fires while standing ankle-deep in freezing water. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of collapsing, the convoy adapted. Escorts broke formation, counterattacked, and hunted the submarines in organized patterns. Destroyer HMS Duncan and corvettes, Snowflake and Lucistrife turned Predator, using radar pings to detect periscopes just above the surface. The Hedgehog launchers, firing spiked explosives that detonated only on impact, gave no warning, no telltale sonar echo. For the first time, U-boats were being destroyed faster than they could strike. By dawn on May 6th, 7 U-boats had been sunk. The rest fled. It was a small victory in numbers, but a massive one in meaning. In his war diary, Dönitz admitted what he had refused to believe. The enemy air and escort forces have now gained control of the North Atlantic. The invincible hunters had become the hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic, once thought unwinnable, had reached its turning point. What made ONS-5 decisive was not firepower alone, but the synthesis of technology, intelligence, and deception. Some of the merchant ships had been fitted with experimental radar jammers. Others broadcast false signals to confuse U-boat tracking. Allied aircraft, guided by ultra-codebreakers, struck at U-boats as they surfaced to recharge batteries, often before the Germans realized they had been located. The battle's climax came in fog, a symbolic veil between the old and new Atlantic. Ships fired blindly, flashes of gunfire illuminating ghostly shapes through the mist. Sailors swore they saw phantom ships, vessels that weren't there, as radar screens flickered with false echoes intentionally broadcast by Allied signal units to mislead the U-boats. By night's end, what had begun as a routine wolf pack assault ended as a rout. The convoy reached Halifax battered but intact. More importantly, the myth of U-boat invincibility was broken. From that moment onward, the North Atlantic no longer belonged to Dönitz's men. It belonged to the escorts, to the scientists, to the operators in code rooms and radar huts, and to the illusions that made the ocean an invisible trap. The Allies had learned to fight the unseen war and win it. But the price of that victory was only beginning to show. In the months that followed Convoy ONS-5, the Atlantic transformed from a graveyard of ships into a killing ground for submarines. Between May and July 1943, the Allies destroyed over 100 U-boats, more than in the entire previous year. What had once been called the happy time by German sailors turned into what they now whispered as the Black May. For the first time, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his fleet. His crews were exhausted, his technology outpaced, his strategy collapsing under the weight of Allied adaptation. "We have lost control of the Atlantic," he wrote to Hitler. "Our losses are unsustainable." The reason wasn't just better weapons, it was total coordination. Each convoy was now a floating web of intelligence. Surface escorts with radar and sonar, aircraft flying patrols from escort carriers, shore-based direction finders, and command centers reading decrypted German signals through Ultra, the product of Bletchley Park's relentless codebreakers. The war beneath the waves had become a chess match of mathematics and nerve. On May 23, 1943, the U-boat U-752 attempted to attack convoy SC-130. As it surfaced to fire torpedoes, a Grumman Avenger from the escort carrier Bogue swooped in low, releasing depth charges that straddled the submarine's hull. The sea erupted. Within minutes, U-752 broke the surface, crippled, only to be finished off by the corvette Pelican. It was one of 10 U-boats destroyed in a single convoy battle. The old Atlantic War, the silent predator and the helpless victim, was gone. But something else was happening. Just below the surface of this victory, the Allies had begun deploying dummy convoys, entire phantom routes simulated with radio transmissions, radar echoes, and decoy ships to draw U-boats into empty seas. These false fleets, coordinated by the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command, used the same call signs, convoy codes, and timing as real groups. German intelligence wasted precious submarines chasing shadows. At the same time, special service vessels, modern descendants of the WW2 ships, returned to the water. Disguised as trawlers or merchantmen, these ships carried hidden weapons, radar beacons, and sound decoys designed to lure U-boats close before striking. One such vessel, HMS Fidelity, operated off the Azores. She appeared slow and harmless, her crew staging fake distress signals in Morse code to tempt submarines to the surface. When one approached within range, the ship's false panels dropped away, revealing a 4-inch gun battery and depth charge racks. The hunter became prey in seconds, even when the deception cost lives, as in Fidelity's eventual sinking. The concept endured. The enemy no longer knew what was real. Every freighter could be a trap. Every signal could be false. By late 1943, the Allied advantage had multiplied. Long-range aircraft, the B-24 Liberators of Coastal Command, finally filled the mid-Atlantic gap, the stretch of ocean once beyond the reach of land-based planes. Now, the U-boats had no sanctuary. The statistics told the story brutally. In March 1943, U-boats sank 108 Allied ships. By July, that number fell to just 13. In the same period, over 60 U-boats were destroyed. The shift was absolute. Dönitz had called the U-boat the only weapon that can bring Britain to her knees. Now, it was the Allies' new phantom fleets, unseen, unmapped, deceptive. That brought his navy to the brink of collapse. Yet the cost was immense. Thousands of Allied sailors still died in the Atlantic. Entire convoys vanished in storms or under torpedo fire. The victory was not clean. It was won in blood and deception. In the cold mathematics of war, illusion had become a weapon as potent as steel. By the year's end, as 1943 faded into 1944, the sea that once belonged to the wolf packs was now patrolled by the hunters. Destroyer escorts, corvettes, and aircraft guided by unseen eyes. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the tide had turned forever. The U-boat menace had been broken not by brute force, but by a union of intelligence, technology, and imagination, a fleet that existed half in shadow and half in steel. The Phantom Fleet had emerged victorious. But what came next? The reconstruction, the new technologies, and the lessons of deception would reshape the future of naval warfare. The Atlantic, once the world's deadliest battlefield, was now a vast mirror reflecting the ingenuity of man and the illusion that saved a continent. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic, once the longest and most perilous campaign of the war, had shifted irreversibly in the Allies' favor. What began as a desperate defense of supply lines had become a methodical hunt for submarines. The numbers told a story of transformation. In March 1943, Allied shipping losses peaked at nearly 700,000 tons in a single month, a catastrophic figure that threatened to starve Britain of oil, food, and ammunition. But by August, losses had dropped below 100,000 tons, while German U-boat sinkings skyrocketed to record levels. For Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had once commanded the U-boat arm with unshakable faith, it was an unraveling. His war diary entries from mid-1943 reveal exhaustion and disbelief. The enemy's control of the air, radar, and sea is now total. Our boats cannot operate with success. Our losses are unacceptable. Between May and September 1943, the Kriegsmarine lost over 150 submarines, roughly 40% of its operational fleet. Many were destroyed before ever sighting an Allied ship. Others were forced to retreat or run out of fuel due to relentless pursuit. The Allies, meanwhile, could finally breathe. Merchant sailors, who had spent years crossing the Atlantic under constant fear, began to see clear horizons again. Convoy routes that were once death traps now carried men, tanks, and munitions safely toward Britain's ports. Convoy on WW2 reached Liverpool with every ship intact, a feat that would have been impossible just months earlier. The escort commanders wrote in their after-action reports, "Enemy sightings, none." The ocean felt empty. It wasn't just the absence of submarines, it was the presence of mastery. Allied coordination now linked thousands of miles of ocean through technology, intelligence, and disciplined procedure. The U.S. Navy's Eastern Sea Frontier and Britain's Western Approaches Command shared real-time information, something unimaginable in the early years of the war. Every sighting, every radio intercept, every sonar ping was logged, triangulated, and transmitted through a chain of command that reached from the decks of corvettes to the code breakers of Bletchley Park. The war at sea had become an integrated machine, part strategy, part science, part illusion. The human cost, however, remained staggering. By the end of 1943, over 30,000 German submariners, three-quarters of all U-boat crews, were dead. Many died without trace, their steel tombs resting on the Atlantic floor. Survivors were rare, and most returned haunted. One captured German officer, interrogated after the sinking of his submarine off Greenland, said quietly, "We no longer hunted. We were hunted. The ocean belonged to the enemy." For the Allies, it was a victory that came at terrible expense. The merchant navy had lost over 30,000 men, many burned, drowned, or frozen in Black Seas. Each Liberty ship that reached its destination was a small miracle of endurance and sacrifice. Yet, for the first time since 1939, there was a sense of momentum, that the tide of the global war was turning. Convoys now arrived faster, losses were predictable, and replacement ships rolled off American shipyards in weeks rather than months. The Liberty ship program, once dismissed by skeptics as rushed and crude, had delivered nearly 3,000 vessels by 1943, proof that industrial might could outbuild destruction. The immediate aftermath of the Atlantic victory was both relief and reckoning. The Allies had won back the sea lanes, but they had also learned that victory required adaptation, not just firepower. The ocean was no longer merely a battlefield. It had become an instrument of deception, technology, and human ingenuity. A vast stage where illusion saved lives. And from this stage, the next act of the war, the invasion of Europe, was about to begin. The defeat of the U-boats did more than secure the Atlantic. It unlocked the rest of the war. For the first time since 1939, the Allied powers could move men and machines across oceans without bleeding to death in the process. The supply lines from North America to Britain became the arteries that would feed the coming invasions of Europe and the Mediterranean. By late 1943, the statistics were staggering. Each month, over 3 million tons of cargo crossed the Atlantic. Tanks, trucks, food, fuel, aircraft, and ammunition. Every convoy that reached port meant another step toward Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Without victory in the Atlantic, D-Day could never have happened. The U.S. Army Air Forces could now stage bombers in Britain with regular resupply of fuel and munitions. The Royal Navy could redeploy escorts from Atlantic duty to support landings in Sicily and Italy. The Canadian Navy, once a small coastal force, had become a major escort armada. In a sense, the Battle of the Atlantic was not only a victory at sea, it was the foundation upon which the liberation of Europe was built, but it also reshaped the doctrines of naval warfare forever. Before 1943, naval power had meant battleships, visible strength, heavy armor, and giant guns. After 1943, it meant information. The invisible became the decisive. Radar, sonar, intelligence, and deception had replaced tonnage as the measure of power. The lessons learned in the Atlantic would echo into the Cold War and beyond. The idea of integrated warfare, air, sea, and intelligence working as one, was born here. The escort carrier, the reconnaissance plane, the sonar ping, the false radar signal, all became tools of a new kind of oceanic chess. The German side, meanwhile, was left in strategic ruin. The Kriegsmarine, once feared, had lost its edge. Its submarines, even the advanced Type 9 and Type 20 prototypes, came too late. German shipyards were bombed relentlessly, their fuel reserves collapsing under Allied air raids. Donitz's fleet could no longer train, no longer hide, no longer win. Morale among U-boat crews disintegrated. Sailors joked bitterly that every mission was a one-way ticket. Donitz himself admitted in a post-war statement, "Our faith in technology could not defeat the enemy's coordination. They learned faster than we could adapt." The German naval archives from late 1944 contain reports describing Allied decoy tactics, fake convoys, radar illusions, false transmissions that left U-boats circling empty waters for days. These deceptions drained fuel, time, and willpower, reducing the once deadly wolf packs to shadows of their former strength. On the Allied side, however, the victory came with humility. The commanders knew how close they had come to defeat in 1942. Had the U-boats maintained their momentum, Britain could have starved, and the war's outcome might have changed entirely. The Allied Phantom Fleet, a mixture of real steel and clever illusion, had saved not just ships, but the very idea of transatlantic cooperation. America's factories and Britain's intelligence agencies had built together a weapon of endurance. one that no single nation could have forged alone. By 1944, the Atlantic was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge, one built from courage, innovation, and deception. Across that bridge came the armies that would land at Normandy, march to Paris, and eventually end the war in Europe. When the final U-boat surrendered in May 1945, the sea that had once consumed empires lay calm again. In its depths rested the wrecks of both arrogance and ingenuity, reminders of a struggle that spanned years, continents, and unseen battles fought in silence. The Atlantic had tested the will of nations and found that victory belonged not to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who listened hardest, adapted fastest, and mastered illusion best. The stage was now set for the final act, not on the sea, but on the shores of Europe. When the Atlantic finally fell silent, it was not the sound of victory that lingered, but the echo of what it had cost. For years, the sea had been both weapon and witness. Beneath its cold surface lay the wrecks of thousands of ships, Allied freighters, German submarines, nameless steel graves that marked the thin line between survival and extinction. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by might alone. It was won by imagination, by the ability to deceive, to disguise, to turn illusion into protection. Yet that triumph carried a quiet irony. To save lives, men had to learn the art of trickery. To defend truth, they had to master deceit. There is an ethical weight in that paradox, that in the vastness of war, honesty becomes a luxury, and illusion a weapon of mercy. The phantom fleets, the fake convoys, the false radar echoes all served the same grim purpose: to mislead an enemy so that others might live. For every convoy that reached port, another vanished beneath the waves. The sailors who fought this invisible war did not wear medals for courage. They wore frost, fatigue, and silence. Many never saw the faces of those they saved, and yet, in the measured calm of history, their victory stands apart. It was not a victory of conquest, but of preservation, of keeping a lifeline alive when the world itself seemed to drown. The Atlantic taught that in modern war, the battle is not just for territory, but for perception. Radar beams, radio waves, and coded signals became the new front lines. The battlefield had expanded beyond sight, into the realm of belief. And in that realm, illusion often proved stronger than steel. Because when Germany's wolf packs hunted in the dark, they never realized the truth. America's Phantom Fleet was already waiting for them.